Most people don't fail because they are lazy. They fail because they never change the one thing that matters. And 30 days ago, Ethan Carter was the perfect example of that truth, because his life looked normal from the outside but empty on the inside. Every morning he would wake up around 11:30 a.m., not because he needed rest, but because he had no reason to get up. His phone was always the first thing he touched, and somehow hours would disappear without him even noticing. He told himself he was just taking a break, just waiting for the right moment. But deep down he knew something was wrong. His friends were moving forward, getting jobs, building routines, talking about goals, while Ethan kept saying he would start tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. And the strange part was, he wasn't stupid. He wasn't incapable. He just couldn't move. It felt like something invisible was holding him back, something quiet but powerful. One afternoon, while sitting alone in his small apartment, sunlight barely coming through the blinds, his phone battery died. And for the first time in a long time, there was silence, no scrolling, no noise, just him and his thoughts. And that's when it hit him, not like a dramatic moment, but like a simple, uncomfortable truth. He realized that nothing in his life would change if he kept doing the same things every day. And for a few seconds, he just sat there staring at the wall, thinking about all the time he had wasted, all the chances he had ignored. And then a question came into his mind, a very small question, but one that felt different from anything he had asked before. What if I don't change everything? What if I just change one thing, just one habit, not a big goal, not a perfect plan, just one small action repeated every day for 30 days? At first, it sounded too simple to matter, almost pointless, but something about it felt possible. Something about it didn't scare him. And for someone like Ethan, that was new, because big goals always made him freeze. But this felt manageable. And without overthinking it, without making a big promise, he made a quiet decision in that moment. He would pick one habit and stick to it for 30 days, no matter how small, no matter how boring. And he didn't know it yet, but that single decision was about to change the way he saw himself forever. The next morning, Ethan woke up earlier than usual, not because he felt motivated, but because the thought from the night before was still sitting in his mind, quiet but persistent. And for a moment, he just lay there staring at the ceiling, already feeling the familiar resistance creeping in, the same voice telling him it was too early, that he could start tomorrow, that one more day would not matter. But this time something was different. He did not argue with the voice. He simply noticed it. And slowly, almost reluctantly, he sat up on the edge of his bed. His room was still the same, slightly messy, dim light coming through the blinds. Nothing magical had changed. But this small movement felt heavier than it should have, like lifting more than just his own body. He had decided the night before that his one habit would be simple. Wake up at 7 a.m. every day, no matter what. No complicated routines, no unrealistic goals, just one clear action. And as he reached for his phone to check the time, he paused, remembering why he was doing this. Not to impress anyone, not to become perfect overnight, but to prove to himself that he could follow through on something. Anything. The clock read 7:12 a.m. He had already missed his target, and for a second, disappointment hit him harder than expected. His mind quickly tried to turn it into an excuse, telling him the day was already ruined, that he should just go back to sleep and try again tomorrow. But then he caught that thought, just like the one from last night, and instead of listening to it, he stood up anyway. Even though he was late, even though it did not feel perfect, he stood up, and that was the first small win. The day felt strange after that, slower, almost uncomfortable. He did not know what to do with the extra hours. He walked around his apartment, made a simple breakfast, something he had not done in a long time, and kept checking the clock as if he was waiting for something to happen. But nothing dramatic did. The world outside continued as usual. Cars passed by, people went to work, and Ethan just existed in a different rhythm than before. By the afternoon, the initial energy faded, and the old habits started calling him back. The couch looked more inviting. His phone felt heavier in his hand, and the urge to fall back into his routine grew stronger. This was the part no one talks about, the quiet pull of comfort, the invisible force that tries to return everything to the way it was. And for a while, he gave in. He scrolled. He wasted time. And a familiar guilt began to build. But something else was there too, something new. a small awareness that he had already done something different that morning, and that it still counted, even if the rest of the day was not perfect, and that thought stayed with him as the sun began to set. He realized that change did not feel exciting or dramatic. It felt slow, awkward, and uncertain. And maybe that was the real challenge. Not doing something big, but repeating something small when it felt like it did not matter. And as he lay in bed that night, tired in a different way, he set an alarm for 7 a.m. again, knowing that the real test was not starting, but continuing the next day. On the third day, the alarm rang at exactly 7 a.m., sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the quiet of Ethan's room. And this time he did not hesitate as long, but the resistance was still there, heavier than before. Because now his mind had evidence of how hard this would be, he sat up slowly, feeling tired, his body still wanting the comfort of staying in bed. And a thought slipped in, telling him that 2 days was already good enough, that he had proven something, that he deserved a break. But then another thought followed, quieter but stronger, reminding him that this was exactly how he had always stopped before, not because he could not continue, but because he convinced himself he had done enough. And that realization made him pause, because for the first time, he could clearly see the pattern, not as a feeling, but as a cycle he had been repeating for years. And without saying anything, he stood up again, not because he felt strong, but because he understood what would happen if he did not. The morning felt slightly easier after that, not easy, but less chaotic, like his mind was slowly adjusting to a new rhythm. He made breakfast again, something simple, eggs and toast, and sat by the window watching the street come to life, people walking with purpose, cars moving steadily, and for a brief moment, he felt like he was part of that world instead of watching it from the outside. But by midday, the struggle returned in a different form, boredom, the kind that made everything feel meaningless. His usual distractions called him back, his phone, the couch, the endless scrolling that required no effort and gave no real satisfaction. And this time, the pull felt stronger because he was tired from resisting it. He picked up his phone, unlocked it, and stared at the screen, knowing exactly what would happen next if he continued. Hours would pass, nothing would change, and the day would disappear just like before. And that awareness made him stop, not immediately, but slowly, like pulling himself back from something familiar. He placed the phone down and leaned back, frustrated, because this was not the kind of change he imagined. There was no excitement, no instant reward, just constant awareness and small decisions that felt heavier than they should. And for a moment, he questioned if this was even worth it, if waking up early really mattered, if one habit could actually change anything. But then he remembered the feeling from the first morning, the small sense of control, the quiet proof that he could do something different. And he realized that maybe the goal was not to feel good right away. Maybe the goal was simply to not go back to the person he was before. And that thought gave him just enough strength to get through the rest of the day, not perfectly, but differently. And that night, as he set his alarm again, something subtle had changed. He was no longer trying to become a better person overnight. He was just trying not to quit today. And that shift, small as it seemed, was the beginning of something deeper than he expected. By the end of the first week, something unexpected began to happen. Not something big or obvious, but something quiet, almost easy to miss. Ethan was still waking up at 7 a.m., not perfectly, not without resistance, but consistently enough that it no longer felt like a shock to his system. The alarm still rang, and he still felt that initial pull to stay in bed, but the decision to get up was becoming slightly faster, slightly less painful, and for the first time, he noticed that the mornings were no longer empty. They had structure. Even if it was simple, he would wake up, wash his face, make breakfast, and sit by the window. And those small actions started to create a sense of order in his day, something he had not felt in a long time. But the real shift was not in what he was doing. It was in how he was thinking, because now, every time he completed that one habit, he had a small piece of proof that he could trust himself. And that feeling was new, unfamiliar, and strangely powerful. However, just as things began to feel easier, a different kind of challenge appeared, one that was harder to notice. The thought that he had already changed enough, that he had proven his point, that maybe he could relax now. This thought did not come with resistance. It came with comfort, which made it more dangerous, because it sounded reasonable. It felt earned. After all, He had been waking up early for several days, something he had not done in years, so why push further? Why not take a break? And for a moment, he almost believed it. He even considered turning off his alarm for the next morning, just to rest, just for one day. But then he paused, remembering the pattern he had seen before, how easily one break turned into two, and two into a full return to old habits. And this time, instead of arguing with the thought, he simply observed it, recognizing it for what it was, not a reward, but a test. And that realization changed everything, because now he was not just following a habit. He was learning how his mind worked. He was seeing the exact moments where he used to give up, and choosing differently, even when it felt small, even when it felt insignificant. And that choice, repeated day after day, started to build something deeper than motivation, something quieter but more stable. Discipline, not the kind that comes from pressure or fear, but the kind that comes from understanding. And as the days passed, Ethan noticed another change. His energy was different, not dramatically higher, but more consistent. He no longer felt completely drained before the day even began, and that alone made everything else slightly easier. He still had moments of distraction, still found himself reaching for his phone, still felt the urge to go back to his old routine, but now there was a gap, a small space between the urge and the action, and in that space, he had a choice, and more often than before, he chose differently. And as he lay in bed on the seventh night, setting his alarm again, he realized something simple but important. This was no longer about proving that he could wake up early. It was about proving that he could become someone who does not quit, and that identity, slowly forming beneath the surface, was far more powerful than the habit itself. By the second week, the routine had settled into something that almost looked normal from the outside. But inside Ethan, the experience was far from simple, because this was the stage where the excitement had completely disappeared, and what remained was repetition, quiet, steady, and often boring repetition. Every morning the alarm rang at 7 a.m., and he got up, sometimes immediately, sometimes after a short pause. But he got up, and that was what mattered. The habit was no longer new, and because of that, it no longer felt impressive. And this created a new kind of doubt, a subtle voice that asked a dangerous question: is this really changing anything? At first, Ethan tried to ignore it, focusing on the fact that he had stayed consistent. But the question kept returning, especially during the quiet moments of the day, when nothing exciting was happening, when he was not seeing dramatic results, when his life still looked mostly the same. He still did not have a new job, his apartment was still small, his days were still simple, and part of him began to wonder if all this effort was leading anywhere. This was different from the resistance he felt at the beginning. This was not about starting, it was about believing. And for a few days, that doubt stayed with him, making each morning feel heavier than it should, because now he was not just fighting laziness, he was questioning the purpose behind his actions. But something unexpected happened during one of those mornings. As he sat by the window with his breakfast, watching people walk by, he realized that he had not once checked his phone since waking up. And that small observation caught his attention, because it was not something he had planned. It was something that had changed naturally, without force, and that made him think about the past few days more carefully. He noticed that he was slightly more aware during the day, slightly more present. He was noticing things he used to ignore, like the way the light entered his room, the sounds of the street, even his own thoughts. And while these changes were small, they were real, and more importantly, they were consistent. And that consistency began to shift his perspective, because he started to understand that change was not always visible from the outside. Sometimes it was internal, gradual, almost invisible until you paid close attention, and that realization gave him a different kind of motivation, not the loud, emotional kind, but a quiet confidence that something was happening beneath the surface. However, just as he began to feel this shift, life tested him again. One evening, he stayed up later than usual, watching videos, losing track of time. And when he finally looked at the clock, it was well past midnight, and immediately, the old pattern tried to return, telling him that the next morning was already lost, that waking up at 7 a.m. would be pointless, that he should just sleep in and start again the following day. And for a moment, the logic felt convincing, because it sounded reasonable. But then he remembered something simple. This was not about perfect days. It was about not breaking the chain, and even if he felt tired, Even if the day was not ideal, waking up still mattered, and that thought stayed with him as he went to bed. And when the alarm rang the next morning, it felt harder than it had in days. His body was heavy, his eyes wanted to stay closed, and every part of him argued against getting up. But this time, the decision came from a deeper place, not from emotion, not from motivation, but from a quiet commitment he had been building day by day, and slowly. Without thinking too much, he sat up, proving to himself once again that the real change was not in the habit itself, but in the person who kept choosing it by the third week. The change was no longer something Ethan had to force every single moment, but it was also not something that felt easy. It had become something in between, something steady, something that required attention but no longer drained all of his energy. And that shift brought a new kind of awareness, because now that the habit was part of his routine, he began to notice everything around it more clearly. He noticed how his mornings felt longer, how the early hours gave him space to think, how he was no longer rushing through the start of his day or waking up already feeling behind. And this small sense of control started to spread into other parts of his life without him even trying. One afternoon, as he was sitting in his apartment, he looked around and realized how cluttered everything had become, not just physically, but mentally. Unfinished thoughts, ignored responsibilities, things he had been avoiding for weeks. And for the first time, instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt a quiet urge to fix something. Not everything, just something. So he stood up and cleaned a small corner of his room. Nothing dramatic, just clearing a table, organizing a few items. And when he finished, he paused, noticing how that one small action changed the way the space felt. It was subtle, but it mattered, and that moment stayed with him, because it showed him that action did not have to be big to create change. It just had to be consistent. However, as the days continued, another challenge began to appear, one that was less about effort and more about identity, because now Ethan was no longer just someone trying to change. He was someone who had been consistent for weeks, and that created a strange tension inside him. Part of him began to believe that he was no longer the lazy person he used to be, but another part still held on to that old identity, still whispered that this was temporary, that he would eventually fall back. And this inner conflict became more noticeable during moments of stress. One morning, he woke up feeling unusually tired, his body heavy, his mind slow, and the thought came back stronger than before, telling him that this was where it would end, that this was where he would slip, that this was proof he had not really changed. And for a moment, he believed it. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, feeling that familiar doubt return. But then something different happened. Instead of reacting immediately, instead of giving in or fighting the thought, he observed it, almost like he was watching someone else. And in that moment, he realized something important. The thought was the same as before, but he was not, because this time, he had weeks of proof behind him, weeks of showing up, weeks of not quitting. And that changed the weight of the decision, because now it was not just about one morning. It was about everything he had built so far, and slowly, without any dramatic feeling, he stood up again, not because it was easy, but because it was who he was becoming. And that distinction, small but powerful, began to reshape the way he saw himself. He was no longer asking if he could change. He was starting to see that he already was. And that realization did not come with excitement. It came with a quiet certainty, a sense that something inside him had shifted in a way that could not easily go back. And as he moved through the rest of the week, he carried that feeling with him, not as motivation, but as identity, something stable, something real, something that continued to grow each time he chose to keep going. As the fourth week began, the change inside Ethan became visible in ways he had not expected, not through anything dramatic, but through the reactions of the people around him. One morning, as he stepped outside earlier than usual, he ran into his neighbor, someone he had seen many times but never really spoken to. And for the first time, instead of avoiding eye contact, Ethan greeted him, and the conversation that followed was simple, brief, but different, because it reflected something new, a presence, a calmness that had not been there before. And as the day went on, he began to notice similar moments, small interactions that felt easier, more natural, as if he was no longer hiding behind the version of himself he used to be. And this external reflection started to reinforce what he had been building internally. However, with this shift came a new kind of pressure. Because now it was not just about proving something to himself. It was about maintaining what others were beginning to notice. And that awareness created a subtle tension, a fear that if he slipped, everything would fall apart, that people would see him as the same person he used to be. And this fear, while quiet, was powerful because it did not push him to quit. It made him afraid of failing. And for a moment, that fear almost felt heavier than the laziness he had been fighting before. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, he reflected on the past weeks, thinking about how far he had come, but also feeling the weight of expectation building. And the question returned, what if this does not last? What if I go back? What if all of this disappears? And this time, instead of pushing the thought away, he sat with it, letting it exist without reacting. And slowly, he realized something important. The fear of losing progress was still a form of doubt, just in a different shape. And if he let that fear control him, it could lead him back to the same patterns, overthinking, hesitation, and eventually inaction. And that realization shifted his perspective once again, because he understood that this was not about holding on tightly to change. It was about continuing the process, one day at a time, without trying to control the outcome. And the next morning, when the alarm rang, he felt a different kind of calm, not excitement, not pressure, just a simple awareness of what needed to be done. He got up, followed his routine, and moved through the day with the same steady rhythm he had built over the past weeks. And as the final days of the month approached, something became clear. The habit itself was no longer the challenge. Waking up early had become a part of his life, almost automatic. But the real transformation had happened deeper, in the way he responded to his thoughts, in the way he handled doubt, in the way he chose action over comfort again and again. And this internal shift began to show itself in ways he had not planned. He found himself thinking about new possibilities, considering ideas he would have dismissed before, and for the first time in a long time, the future did not feel distant or unclear. It felt open. And as he looked ahead to the final days of his challenge, he realized that whatever happened next would not be defined by a single habit, but by the person he had become through it. Someone who no longer waited for the right moment, but created it through small, consistent choices. On the 30th morning, the alarm rang just like it had every day before. But this time, Ethan did not feel resistance. He did not hesitate. And he did not question whether it was worth it. He simply opened his eyes and got up, as if it was something he had always done. And as he stood there in the quiet of his room, he realized something subtle but powerful. The struggle that once felt so heavy was no longer there, not because the habit had become easier, but because he had become different. He moved through his morning routine with a calm sense of clarity, making breakfast, sitting by the window, watching the early light spread across the street. And for the first time, he was not thinking about the challenge. He was not counting the days. He was simply present, and that presence felt like something he had been missing for a long time. Later that day, he decided to do something he had not planned at the beginning. He picked up his phone, opened the camera, and recorded a short video, not to impress anyone, not to go viral, but to document what had happened. He spoke honestly, explaining how he had started with just one habit, how difficult the first days were, how his mind kept trying to pull him back, and how slowly, almost without noticing, things began to change. He talked about the boredom, the doubt, the moments he almost quit, and the quiet decision to continue anyway. And when he finished recording, he hesitated for a moment, unsure if it even mattered, but then he posted it, not expecting anything, just letting it be, and went on with his day. But something unexpected happened. Hours later, his phone began to buzz. Notifications started appearing. People were watching, commenting, sharing. And what surprised him most was not the number of views, but the words people were leaving. They were not praising him for waking up early. They were saying they saw themselves in his story, that they understood the struggle, that they had been stuck in the same pattern. And for the first time, Ethan realized that what he thought was a small, personal change was actually something many people were quietly dealing with. The video continued to spread, reaching more people than he ever imagined. And with each notification, the same message repeated in different ways. It was not about the habit, it was about the feeling of being stuck and the hope that maybe change was possible. And as he sat there reading those messages, something shifted again. He understood that the reason this moment felt so powerful was not because he had completed 30 days, but because he had proven something deeper, that change does not come from one big decision. It comes from showing up when it is difficult, from choosing action when comfort is easier, and from repeating that choice until it becomes part of who you are. And as the day came to an end, Ethan looked at his phone one more time, seeing the number of people who had connected with his story, and for a moment, he wondered about something he had not thought of before. If one small habit could lead to this, what else could change if he kept going that night? After the messages slowed down and the notifications became less frequent, Ethan sat quietly in his apartment, the same place where everything had started, but it no longer felt the same. The walls had not changed, the furniture was still simple, the space was still small, but the atmosphere was different, because he was different, and as he reflected on the past 30 days, he realized that what he had gained was not just a habit, it was a new way of seeing himself. Before, he used to think that change required something big, something dramatic, a moment of sudden motivation or a perfect plan, but now he understood that real change was built in silence, in the small decisions no one sees, in the mornings when it feels easier to stay in bed, but you choose to get up anyway, in the moments when doubt appears and you decide not to follow it. And this understanding felt more valuable than any result he could measure, because it was something he could carry forward, something that would not disappear after 30 days. And as he thought about the messages people had sent him, he noticed a common pattern. Many of them were still waiting, waiting for the right time, waiting to feel ready, waiting for something outside of them to change before they started, and he recognized that feeling immediately, because it was the same place he had been in not long ago, and that made him realize something even deeper. The difference between staying stuck and moving forward was not ability, it was not intelligence, it was not even motivation, it was the willingness to take one small action without knowing exactly where it would lead, and to repeat that action even when it felt insignificant. And as simple as that sounded, he knew how difficult it was, because he had lived through it. He had felt the resistance, the doubt, the boredom, the temptation to quit, and that was what made the result meaningful. Not the number of days, not the attention his video received, but the fact that he had stayed with the process long enough to become someone new. And as he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below, he felt a sense of calm that was different from anything he had felt before. It was not excitement, it was not relief, it was something steadier, something grounded. The understanding that his life was no longer controlled by the patterns he used to follow, and that he had the ability to shape it, one choice at a time. And for a moment, he thought about what he would do next, not in terms of goals or plans, but in terms of who he wanted to become. And instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt ready, not because he had everything figured out, but because he had learned something simple and powerful. That change does not begin when you feel ready. It begins when you decide to act. And as he turned away from the window, one quiet question stayed in his mind. If one small habit could change this much, what would happen if he continued, not for 30 days, but for the rest of his life?